Hey everyone, welcome to the Darshan Talks podcast. This is your host, Darshan Kulkarni. It's my mission to help patients and you trust the products you depend on. As you know, I'm an attorney, I'm a pharmacist, and I advise companies with FDA-regulated products. So if you think about drugs, wonder about devices, consider cannabis or obsess over pharmacy, this is the podcast, this is the live stream for you. I do have to say, since I'm a lawyer, this is not legal advice. I'm doing this because I actually just enjoy the conversation and it's educational. And because of that, I find myself learning something new each time. It'd be nice to know if someone's listening. So if you like what you hear, please leave a comment, please subscribe. And if you are in the technology space, please share, because today's conversation is going to be exactly the type of conversation you want to hear. Because we're going to talk about consent and we're going to talk about technology and consent. So feel free to actually share this. If you want to find me, you can also always find me on Twitter at Darshan Talks, or just go to our website at darshantalks.com. I briefly hinted at this, but our podcast today, or live stream today, is going to be about, how should we put this? It's going to be about consent. It's going to be about data dignity. What does that mean? And how is this going to change the life sciences and regulations as we continue? Our guest today is the CEO of Acor. He is a friend of mine. I've known him for several years at this point. He is hiding his name apparently at this second, but it's going to be a surprise. But he's actually literally known globally for the type of stuff he does around blockchain, around digital ledger technologies in general. And our guest for today, Jim Nasr. Jim, good to have you back.
It's great to be back, Darshan. Always good to connect with you, whether it's offline in our usual jibber jabbering, or whether it's here with the rest of the world.
Always. So we have to start with the obvious question. Why the flag behind you?
Because I'm an Atlanta United fan and I live in Atlanta. I'm a founding member, and yeah, you got to support the team.
So Jim is, when I worked with Jim was known to be incredibly fit and spend a lot of time spending a lot of energy on that. So knowing that he's the founding member of the team does not surprise me in the least. And yet I'm surprised that he has time to do anything. So kudos to you, Jim. So Jim, let's actually talk about today's topic. Our topic today, and we hinted at this briefly, was this idea of data dignity. Could you talk a little bit about what that is?
Yeah. So really the idea is that we as individuals these days, we create a lot of data. We create a lot of value because of that data. However, as things have evolved, really we are largely the product of really a very small number of companies, ways of expressing that data. A simple example is Facebook or Instagram. You go in there, you put your pictures or videos or whatever, you're creating data. However, you don't really own that data, and that you are essentially the product, right? So whatever advertising or whatever direction those organizations want to take with your data, that's their right. And then really ultimately it's this idea that we're in a place where now as creators of data, we need to at the very least have some idea of what's happening to that data and whether it's being used for various purposes, whether there's a secondary market for it and things like this. And if at the very least, trace and monitor it, if not have a stake in its value, if there's a marketplace, be able to share in it as an example, right? And of course it also kind of gets into this area of ethics, which I know you're certainly on top of, and really ethical usage of your data by organizations, particularly without consent. That's a very big deal. I think also it's one of those things that we all want to kind of, I think we're getting to a stage where whether it's regulators or individuals like us, organizations, there's a much greater awareness of this kind of concept of a data land grab. And, and we need to participate in that because we are the creators and the owners of the data as individuals. Right, and that's a fact. I mean, this obviously very well when it comes to medical data, health data, but it's certainly a lot more than that. It's not just your traditional clinical data. It's so much data is being generated by us, through other means, such as sensor-based data and wearables and genomic data, you name it, and all of that really is valuable. We're very much in a data as a currency space.
So you talk about this data as a currency space. You talk about the fact that people should have data dignity and should be able to control what happens with their data, and including saying, no, you can't have my data, which I think sounds amazing in concept. But at the same time, if someone goes, you know what, Darshan, I want you to give me your information. In exchange, I'll let you see this article. I know that from my perspective, I know it's a very lopsided discussion, but I kind of go, it's easier to give me your login. Give you my my not login, but the email address or whatever, so that I can see the article and I can move on. And I know that in 5 years, that data is probably going to be worthless. So do I really need to worry about it? So talk to me about the value of data dignity when data itself gets stale, and how does that play out?
Well, I mean, again, we can't make a blanket statement on everything, and there's definitely different sensitivities in data and different values. So you look at patient health data, your collective, and again, not just the clinical data as an EHR, but the collective data as a patient. There's a lot of value in that. There's tremendous value, and not just, again, for the primary market. So as example, all of us have been going through COVID, right? And what's been happening and patients going through the cycle of being involved in clinical trials. So there's definitely value in that. There's value for the sponsors, and ultimately they're making compounds and they're making drugs, they're selling them and making money and so on and so forth. But then there's also a significant amount of value in kind of like beyond that initial interaction, right? Whether it's in the marketing, pharmacovigilance phases, or whether it's secondary data marketplaces where you take data from different places and essentially generate new, kind of assessments, if you like, or observations based off of it. So that's a different kind of, or much more valuable data as example than if you provide you email for, like a kind of an isolated newsletter or something like this. Now, again, the really scary thing, Darshan, and this is why we've kind of gone down this path of exploring how you can protect individuals' rights and look at transactions associated to any kind of consent as example they have, is in isolation. That snapshot of your data interaction may not be that significant, but in collection and as an overall 360 is extremely valuable. Now it really reveals a lot about you, and probably a lot more than you would want to reveal about yourself, certainly publicly, or to any private organization, right? And I'm not just picking on you. I think it'll be the case for almost all of us, right? I think that's the issue that many of us don't see. It's kind of like the forest for the trees problem. Right, we're kind of, we're getting hit by the trees, but really there's a big forest in there, and it's very easy, unfortunately, very easy, and it could be as simple as using cookies, or it could be much more, comprehensive and sophisticated using machine learning and predictive analytics and things like this to essentially kind of build a profile of every individual based on their data trail, and if you have no idea what's going on, and particularly have no idea of who is doing what else with your data, and you've not provided consent or have an ability to monitor some of that, that's not a good place to be. I think that's like the opposite of having data dignity. I think that's where the issue of unethical data usage, is most likely going to happen. And again, none of this is science fiction. This idea of identity theft, I mean, it's really happening. This is, it's happening to a lot of people, and it's not just because you went to a restaurant and somebody kind of wrote down your credit card number. I think that's a seriously kind of like, caricature version of it. There's a lot more sophisticated, much more electronic, much more like behind the scenes type things happening that really we don't know about. And I think ultimately all that stuff, when you look at all of us essentially being, kind of servants to this, right, our phone, and it's true, and everything goes through there globally. That's the trail that we're talking about. Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry, I had a car going outside. There's so many things to talk about here, so I want to sort of raise the first thing because you kind of touched on it. Before we move into anything else, can you talk to me a little bit about the identity theft? What is the behind the scene, because what I still think I think I'm pretty sophisticated, and I recognize that there are some elements of identity theft which are more subversive than the typical I stole your ATM card information. But as someone who lives in technology, what are the types of identity thefts that are more subversive?
Well, we could speak about this for a long time. I think that the really, to me, the biggest, scariest thing is this idea that there are a number of organizations, and honestly, they're not organizations you've probably ever heard of, that are actively building massive profiles of every individual. And then they sell those profiles for all kinds of reasons and to all kinds of organizations. I'm not trying to suggest here this is all unethical. However, again, let's go back to this whole idea of distributed computing and why are we even doing it? Well, one reason, and the purists, if you like, behind this, believe in this idea of removing one entity as having all the power, all the control. Because that one entity, if I knew that like all of the world's information was housed in your database, as example, in your basement, then my number one objective probably is going to be trying to hack into your database, right? Yeah, because there's a lot of value there.
Yeah.
And when one or two or three entities kind of have that kind of control, so they're certainly susceptible to attacks and being hacked, even if they're ethical themselves. But there's all kinds of leakages that happen. And I think this idea of decentralized computing is, and again, not to diverge into that, but it's really this idea that like, instead of having one or two giant mega centers, you could have 10,000 little kind of data holders, if you like, and they all work together in a collaborative way, because hacking into 10,000 databases, especially ones that are synchronized constantly, is very, very, very difficult, right? Is a whole lot more difficult than doing like one giant data center. So back to identity theft, though, is really ultimately as these profiles are being generated largely without our consent and then without our information, they can certainly be used in all kinds of ways, whether it's completely unethical, whether it's borderline, unethical and just without consent, or whether it's, essentially something that you have somehow consented to without really understanding the full extent of the consent, which is a lot of times the issue too, because, you sign a piece of paper, it's kind of out of context. It's out of context of a much bigger picture, but the reality is part of that picture. And I think clever people, clever technologies allow all that stuff to be exposed,
So what I hear you saying is you're not using the word identity theft in the typical nefarious way. You're using the term identity theft in a much broader context, which is your identity is being used in ethical and non-ethical ways that basically subvert your data dignity, for lack of a better term.
We could be splitting hairs here. I think identity theft, ultimately, there's a crime that's being involved, right? It's not accidental, right?
No.
The idea of having like essentially 360 views of individuals without their knowledge, that's a business, right? Those are businesses, and that there's all kinds of companies that do this stuff. They're aggregators, and a number of them in the medical space, and they use intermediaries to essentially collect nuggets of information, and they kind of create their own proprietary schema, I feel like, and then they sell that, And again, most people are unaware of this. It's a huge business, but the reality of all of this is that I don't think there's way better ways around this, right? I remember from my days at the CDC, instead of paying lots of money to aggregators, it would have been a whole lot better, cleaner data, much more engaging to work with patients or representatives of patients directly than getting dirty data you paid a lot of money for from a few aggregators. That's just one example, but I think it's just getting more and more. It's a much bigger problem now. It's a much bigger picture, just because there's so much that's happening on the data side. But I think that the other side of this, and I'm going to talk about this, is that the regulators have kind of woken up. I think that there's a lot more regulatory awareness of what's happening, even if individuals like you and I may still not pay attention to it. I think more of us are, just because it's conversation as an example. But regulators, and again, we just saw this. I think last week Amazon was fined $887 million by the EU for all kinds of data violations related to the GDPR, General Data Protection Regulations. So the whole idea then ultimately is that none of this is a surprise. I mean, this is not like, you and I just uncovered this, but I think, it's time to address it because, this is a massive both ethical as well as economical situation that if out of control can impact all of us.
So you talk about the value of this data, and I want to get into this a little bit more because the value of this data, and you're talking about regulators waking up to it. Some regulators are waking up to it with this idea that we need to protect people. But then you've got Israel coming out and saying, we are the startup nation. We want COVID data to be available. Just come here, develop new drugs, new vaccines with us. You've got China saying, we want this data because we want global surveillance. How does all of that get managed? How do you sort of see that balance, if you will, on we want data dignity, we want control, versus government saying, no, we want the control, we don't want you to have it. Do you see the distinction, and why does it matter?
I do. And again, obviously we can't necessarily go through every kind of exception to the rule. I think the rule, though, as I see it, is that, and again, this goes back to the mobile phone, the smartphone. That's the reason why. Because if you said, well, how come 20 years ago this wasn't such a big, big deal? Yes, the reason that 20 years ago we didn't have 8 billion smartphones running around creating data and tying us individually, to engagements, right? I think that's fundamentally what I think is happening, and also the fact that, and this is very, very proven already, that we are generating more data, particularly unstructured data, now, like over a course of a year, that we have ever created through the whole course of humanity. I think those numbers are all like really out there. So the point, though, is that I think this idea that an individual has data rights, that is kind of a new thing. It really wasn't. It wasn't something that was very seriously thought through, or even the use cases were not that mature 20 years ago, right? But everything has changed, and I think so. Therefore, all of us, regulators, technologists, entrepreneurs, advisors, all of us are trying to catch up into some of these ideas because the space has moved so much faster than all of the checks and balances around it. Now, does that preclude you, kind of being fully open and transparent about sharing data or whatever? The answer is no. Obviously, most people do that, like on social media, freely. I think the thing, though, and this is where we kind of come from, is look, people are doing this, and ease of use and consumerism, is incredibly important. Again, going back to the mobile phone, but it doesn't mean that technologists like us can just say, well, we'll just build whatever, and we don't care about security, privacy, accountability, traceability. We can't do that because, end of the day, when people realize en masse that all these things are happening and how they're individually impacted or could be impacted, they're going to be, at the very least, alarmed, right? If not, have a serious connection that, whoa, what is going on? So I think it's completely, incumbent on us as technologists and entrepreneurs to build in these degrees of accountability, security, privacy preservation, traceability, real-time kind of like information back to individuals, because we see this, even if not everybody else does at this moment, right? So I think those are the things that are kind of different, because, the alternative then is you say, you know what, well, we're just going to rely on 3 organizations, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, as example, but a pretty close to the mark example, to essentially control everything. You look at the internet right now, it's largely controlled by 4 or 5 organizations. That's the truth of it.
Yeah.
And that was never the intention behind the internet. It was never, let's make, Bezos and Zuckerberg the richest people in the world. That was never the intention behind it, right? So
you talk about having more control. You talk about this idea that,
but I'm not sure if I necessarily think control. I think control is one of those overloaded words. and it has a lot of connotations that I don't necessarily believe is practical right now. I think it's much more about traceability, monitoring, auditability at this stage. Control is like 1 or 2 stages removed from where we're at right now.
Fair enough. So let's say we're talking about monitoring and having a deeper understanding of what's out there. Let me ask you this question. How do you enable, through the technology solutions you have, how do you enable that to happen?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I think this is really the crux of what we have been working on. And Darshan, you know this from our open pharma days and working with people who just generally are self-serving and don't understand these kind of concepts. And even before that, ultimately, we have an opportunity, particularly with public blockchain technology, and I'm very specific about that because it's not any technology, to have an immutable ledger, a public ledger that shows, like, Jim and Darshan talked at 11 a.m. Eastern on August 5th. It doesn't say what you and I talked about. There is no reference directly to this podcast per se. If we wanted to, and we wanted to provide a link to this podcast, we'd probably have that in a private database. But we say, oh, okay, on the ledger it shows Jim and Darshan talked at 11. If you really want to find out what it is, you click on this link. The link says, okay, do you have private permission to be able to go and tap into this, as an example. So I think this idea of traceability, this idea of monitoring, particularly in real time, not like a month down the line, is completely doable now. And blockchain technology allows us to do it. There's a few nuances, but for instance, you can use non-fungible tokens to associate. Like, as an example, you could take your podcast, you could associate which is a digital asset, right? There's an hour-long podcast. You're gonna save it as an MP3 file, whatever. You can associate it to a non-fungible token. That non-fungible token is a unique identifier in the world. There will not be another one just like it. It's unique to this event. And then if you wanted to track, for instance, how many people looked at your podcast over the course of time from different sources, not just from your website, which you have some control over, but from all kinds of different sources, right? Or who shared it with whom later on. You could potentially do it just because that token is unique. Now, could you see, if they actually looked at like a particular piece of the video? Probably not, right? That's the next step. So that's really this idea of traceability, accountability, auditability. Now, in the case of this podcast, it's public, so it's a use case that may not make sense. But there are many, many other use cases where you want to have some kind of a reference that's immutable and public, and really, in our lingo, is computationally trustworthy. Or using cryptography, you can trust it. So it's not just relying on you and I or a private database to say, yes, this happened. It's really relying on public cryptography. And then from there on, any kind of transaction associated with it can be related or can be associated to that particular token. That's the basic idea, but really ultimately all of this kind of comes down to this idea of tokenization, right? Which is really at the heart of a public blockchain, right? Which is to say that when you use tokenization, you basically, I think of it as value creation, attribution. So if you're creating value, so you and I speaking, we're creating some kind of value, maybe just for the two of us, right? But that's two is better than none. So that value is now associated, to some kind of a token, and that ledger essentially shows you a reference to the token. Pretty simple idea, and if you expand the idea of tokenization, whether it's regular tokens that are, essentially kind of like that you can trade, it's like, for instance, one Bitcoin, right? If I bought Bitcoin 10 years ago, right, which would have been $2, with a one that, or versus one that I bought yesterday at $40,000, it's still one Bitcoin, right? So if I wanted to exchange that one Bitcoin with you, it doesn't matter if it's the one I bought at $2 or the one at $40,000. That's basically fungible. There is no differentiation between the one from 10 years ago or the one from yesterday, from your perspective. From my perspective, it was $39,000 difference, right?
Right. Right.
But the idea is it's fungible. And then, so that's one set of tokens. And then the other kind, which has become very popular lately, is non-fungible, which is that token that was issued at that time for this podcast. This podcast is a very good example. It's unique. There is no other podcast like this in the world ever, by definition. It's during this time frame, The conversation, is specific. There is not a conversation that's going to happen that will be identical to this conversation, right? So we could associate non-fungible token to this podcast. We could encrypt it using a hashing technology and associate the podcast in encrypted form with a token. And thereafter, for the rest of eternity, that will be a unique token, right? So you could never trade that particular token with something else that will be identical to it because it's a non-fungible token. So that's kind of the idea, right? That's really where the tokenization idea comes from, and the things that we can do to actually take some of these ideas that we talked about, and really make it practical, make it real.
So we're literally running out of time here, but I'm going to ask you one last question because it's something you and I discussed right before we got on, but I think it's kind of important. We talk about immutability, we talk about tokenization, we talk about taking data and having more access and the word's not control, obviously, it's management. I forget the term you used, but the idea being you can do all these things. My big question though is how do you reconcile that with the requirements of GDPR or CCPA or the new Colorado law? How does all of that work together when they say you need to have the right to delete the information?
Yeah, really it's kind of a good news situation, Darshan, because in fact, those regulations, in some ways really kind of expedite the thinking and building solutions in this way. Because, if the regulators are expecting you, for instance, let's go back to GDPR, right? GDPR has one of the elements of GDPR is basis for consent. It's the same thing with CCPA, the California Consumer Protection Act, right? They both explicitly say basis for consent. So you have to prove consent. And it's not just a one-time, one-and-done thing. As you know, in the world of clinical trials, we're very much in the world of dynamic consent now, where consent is not a snapshot, it's one that changes. So you could have a consent that you start with, and then maybe it expires, maybe it's revoked, maybe it's renewed, maybe there's a chain of custody event. So it's much more dynamic. It's got multiple states in it. So really, through this immutability and accountability, we're able to show really, again, going back to this idea of public ledger and using cryptography, we're able to show with technologies that are proven, and I'm not relying on one entity. It's not just my word, that transactions happen in the order and with the kind of accountability and regulatory requirements that were expected to happen. Right, and then later on, if a regulator, if the FDA comes and says, "Hey, you got these 20,000 children, right, who are participating in this COVID-19 under 12 study, show me all of the consents that the parents signed." Real scenario, right? And show me, who's revoked, and show me that if one of them has to be deleted, that you have done it. That all of this can be done in a timely manner. In fact, if you build it correctly, it could be done essentially on demand, in real time. Yeah, and that's the kind of technologies we have built, because we're really big believers that, circa 2021, almost everything we're talking about here can be done in real time. And the truth is, it really can be. This does not have to be like the old days of let's do a kind of a discovery session. Let's spend 6 months and $18 million with lawyers. That's really.
Wait a second. That's where I draw the line. We need to eat too.
We need to make you more useful, Darshan. That is my objective in life.
Thank you. Thank you for helping there. Anyways, Jim, this was as usual amazing. Let me ask you 4 questions before we let go. Okay. The first, based on what we've discussed, what would you like to ask the audience?
I think I would like to ask the audience, if they're there, what it is that interests them in this kind of conversation, whether they're kind of, I typically see 2 communities. One is the crypto community, where they're already very interested, they're engaged, they're really kind of aware of what's happening. And I think from their side, typically the kind of questions I'm asked or they seem to be interested in are, what is it you guys are doing in the crypto space that's different, right? So that's one community. The other community is I think the community from the domain, people who are like maybe regulators or in the pharma space or healthcare space, and they're more curious about why blockchain? So what? Like is this all smoke and mirrors? And I think both of those communities are completely, yeah, it's great to have that interaction because you get different kind of cadence when you're interacting with them. And it's important to be able to relate and work and learn from both.
So yeah, let's find out. Let's see what they come back with. Let me ask you another question. What is something you've learned in the last month that people will be surprised by?
Personal or in general?
Either, in general.
I think what I've learned over the last month, just going back to our world of technology and things like this, is that there is a real thirst right now in the kind of what I'm going to call the practical community for people to actually to see like real kind of solutions for blockchain. I think there's been a huge amount of like cryptocurrency work and ICOs, and there's been a ton of infrastructure, people talking until they're blue in the face about like layer twos and off chain and all kinds of wallet things. And all of that is interesting for the geeks, but it's really not that interesting in general in terms of solving problems. But I've seen more people come and say, well, my problem actually is I give you a real thing. I'm doing loan origination, right, for properties. And how can I use blockchain? And show me what we can do with blockchain there. Because that's a big problem. It's inefficient. We go through multiple like banks and lawyers and things like this. And the paper gets lost. Can we use blockchain for that? So those kind of questions, I think I'm learning that, and particularly on NFTs. I think people are all of a sudden everybody's talking from basketball stars to people on the road and people like you and I talking about NFTs, and now the questions are more educated questions around NFTs. So all that is good.
So the next question is, what is something that made you happy in the last week?
Let's see. So I've been watching the Olympics, and I'm into cycling these days a lot. I do a lot of cycling, so it was. So it's obviously personal. It's not into work, but this Austrian woman won the road race out of nowhere. Cinderella story. Like she biked essentially by herself for like 100 miles. And won it. And I was just I mean, again, it's low profile in the scheme of the Olympics, but to me, it was just phenomenal. It was one of the most surprising results and incredible performances I have ever seen in sports, and I follow sports, regularly. So
to me, the closest thing is Boris Becker when he came out of nowhere and won the Grand Slam, I believe it was. So in the same way,
1985 at the Wimbledon, yeah.
It was Wimbledon, yeah. There you go.
Yeah, that ages us, Darshan, but okay. I was only 7 months old at that time.
Well, I wasn't born, so there's that. Yeah, sure. But yeah, this is awesome, Jim. I have been posting throughout how people can find you, but for those of you who are listening, Jim, how can they find you?
Is that your fourth question?
That's my fourth question.
All right, well, I'm just keeping track. Yeah, just the usual means, LinkedIn, Twitter are, I think, the easiest paths to find me, and happy to connect.
Perfect. Jim, thank you so much for coming on. It was wonderful to have you, and let's chat soon.
Sounds good. Cheers.
Cheers.